Coming up on the Mouth Check, you've got the U.S. dairy industry now in a position where even the worst case scenario continues to be a threat for Europe or the rest of the world from a milk supply standpoint. Welcome to the Mouth Check from Ted Jacoby and Company, your complete guide to dairy markets, from the milking parlor to the supermarket shelf. I'm Ted Jacoby. Let's dive in. This week, we are excited to have Scott Briggs from Bridgecape Commodities joining us. Scott lives in Australia and really understands what's going on with dairy markets on that side of the pond. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to have you. Why don't we start by having you tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Thanks very much for the intro, Ted. I'm Scott Briggs, Bridgecape Commodities, based down in Melbourne, Australia, and work with a number of Asian and Oceanic consumers to try and understand global dairy markets and try and help them risk manage. Thanks very much for the opportunity to be a part of the podcast.
Scott, thanks for joining us. We're really excited to have you. We're going to have a little bit of a debate. How do U.S. dairy production costs compare to those in New Zealand, Europe, and China today? Do we think the U.S. is building a lasting competitive advantage? And what does that mean for the global dairy market over the next 5 years? Scott, I'll start with you. You're based down under. Do you think the U.S. is developing a competitive advantage, or do you think New Zealand will continue to be in the driver's seat?
It's a very big topic, Ted, but I think the short answer is that, the US is really in a great position to drive global dairy markets over the next 5 to 10 years. One of the major things that's changed probably since about 2015, we've been in a transition period where the marginal milk growth is not coming from a grass-fed system anymore. It's coming from a grain-fed system. Between 2000, when a lot of global dairy markets started to deregulate, we had falling trade controls and those sorts of things, quotas in the EU eventually coming off. Between 2000 and 2015, the marginal milk growth was really coming from a grass-fed system, be it New Zealand growing the number of acres that it planted or the number of acres that it farmed. Places like Uruguay or southern Brazil or Argentina growing quite strongly, and other parts of Europe and Australia as well. So that was the driver of the growth, and that's why we saw that volatility in global dairy markets driving back towards a grass-fed cost of production. But since then, those places have stopped growing, and really the next unit of growth or the next leader of growth comes from grains. And ultimately, that does mean that the US is in a great position to respond to the milk production needs of the world. At the end of the day, you've got the greatest exportable surplus of grains, and you've got a fantastic platform to grow from. That's the 10,000-foot view of why the US is in the box seat.
You mentioned that even New Zealand is starting to go towards a grain-based system. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
I would say that's pretty incipient, Ted, but there's certainly steps that are being taken in New Zealand that seem to mirror what Australia's been doing for probably the last 5 to 10 years. You have a marginal cost of production that is grain-fed, and it's being led by the US. At the moment, if we looked at the margins in the US for a dairy farmer, they're pretty good, given your beef situation. But if you were to remove that beef situation or that beef revenue, you're probably at a pretty low income over feed cost. But that's still a highly profitable milk price for a grass-fed system. And a lot of the fixed costs are already being paid off, be it the farmer's labour, the equipment on the farm, all of those overheads, they're already being paid off by a pasture-fed system. So there's a huge marginal return for that extra litre of milk that comes out of a pasture-fed system. If you look at the steps that have occurred in Australia and that are probably starting to come to New Zealand, it is a lot more shed housing in wetter areas, feed pads, drier feed pads. It's certainly not moving to the barn-fed system that the States has got. More multiple calvers, if you like, to flatten out that milk curve. A lot more maize silage production, which just stores that a little bit better and gives you more dry matter per acre as well. It's these kind of marginal steps which have occurred a lot in Australia or even in some of our more grass-fed areas, and that are starting to occur in New Zealand. And some of the incentives that are being given market-wise in New Zealand to produce that shoulder milk or that additional milk are starting to respond with additional investment on farm.
So there's maybe another way to put it, that core pasture-based part of New Zealand dairy farming continues to be very profitable. But any marginal increase in milk production that would come from New Zealand, the cost of that marginal increase is probably the same, or more likely probably less than the same marginal increase in milk production in the US.
Look, I would say that the marginal cost of production out of the States is pretty good. If you think that you've already got all the infrastructure paid for and it's really just an additional growth there. But I think it's more so the profit margins that sit in a pasture-fed system in New Zealand allow for that investment to try and get that little bit of extra milk as well. So I wouldn't say either or are better placed. It's just that we do have a lot of low-hanging fruit in Oceania, if you like, to start moving into that kind of system.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah.
One thing I think about New Zealand and why the system is the way it has been historically has been your cost of concentrates or grains hasn't always been as competitive. You lead world price in a lot of cases, and your location makes you very competitive. Your dairymen have more room to pay some of those higher costs for that marginal production. So my question is, the strong world price has a fair amount to do, obviously, with everybody's growth. But in your case, when you look at that difference in marginal cost versus that pasture-based cost, are you more sensitive to that marginal change in price than maybe some other markets, just simply because your feed costs are higher?
Let's have a look at world milk prices at the moment. The US at $17 a counterweight, if you like, $16.50, $17 a counterweight. That's low on your range. On the New Zealand numbers, that's coming out at a $9.50 per kilo in New Zealand dollars, which is a historically pretty high milk price. So they do have that ability to just bring in PKE exports. One of the major sources of additional feed or additional milk growth in New Zealand is this palm kernel expeller, which comes off of the palm kernel crushing. It's kind of like soybean meal, if you like, that they bring in from Indonesia and other palm kernel or palm crushing countries. Fonterra had placed limits on that for a long period of time because it was affecting the fat composition of the milk. Once they removed those limits, PKE imports went up 20 or 30%, almost in 1 or 2 years. The last 2 seasons, New Zealand milk growth has been about 4 or 5% this year and probably 2 or 3% the year before, so 6 or 7%. Nearly a third to a half of that has come from the additional energy that's coming in the PKE. So it's having a huge marginal impact on their growth. And it's coming at a pretty low cost because it's a low-cost feed source. So I think, like going back to your question, they have that ability to grow because there's such a lot of low-hanging fruit between that grass-fed cost of production, which is already paying for their farm, and the milk price that they're getting paid, which is actually a marginal cost of production out of the US.
What kind of world fat price might change their incentive on PKE? And we're seeing a little bit of that here because it's very expensive here. And people look at their marginal return. It isn't, of course, near what it was when fat was $2.50. Do you think, depending where that world market settles, will that change the incentive to use PKE? Because in our case, its fat production is a real gain that you get compared to other alternative rations we feed.
I think it's seen more as just a bulk source of feed and source of energy to get the cow up early in the season, Mike, and peak it as high as possible, and then to keep going on the shoulder. It's a milk solids game rather than a tweak the fat percentage game. At $9.50, they'll be feeding it.
Yes.
$9.50 a kilo of milk solids, they'll be feeding.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I would be feeding it here, too. For sure. Yeah.
My thoughts immediately go to Europe. The U.S. is well positioned for growth. New Zealand is building off a very profitable base, which insulates them and puts them in a very good position of at least maintaining their position in the global market. Where does that put Europe?
Europe is an interesting situation where realistically, I think that they're going to struggle for the main drivers of additional milk production. They seem to be struggling to add any additional land at a reasonable cost, whether it be to the feed base or to the dairy base. That's obviously being driven by environmental policy, which is very different in Europe than it is, say, in the US or even Latin America. So I think that they're going to struggle at that policy level to be able to keep driving forward. The other thing that does sit within Europe is that we're only 10 years removed from quota coming off. And so we're still in that process of losing milk production where we should in the more marginal areas or from the smaller farms or from the more marginal land and trying to drive it into places like Germany or the Netherlands. And so whenever you've got a core base of pretty uneconomic, sticky milk, it takes a fairly heavy price response to drive change in those farms. So down at the lowish milk prices that we've got globally at the moment, and I say I'm happy to debate that point. I think we're at pretty low milk prices on the range since the end of COVID, particularly with the low feed prices. Where we are at the bottom of the price range, you're going to still struggle to get some of these European guys out, given the subsidies that they've got. But that also means you're not driving efficiency back into the system. So it feels to me like Europe's going to really struggle to meet the global needs and be a quick mover like the States has been. Probably the call out on that one to me would be Russia. They've got probably huge settings if they wanted Russia and the stands to really grow into dairy production. but it's not going to be something that's being done for the rest of the world. I think it's going to be getting done for their part of the world and for China.
Speaking of Eastern Europe, do you think Poland still has a lot of room to grow as well?
I wouldn't know the specific micro settings of Poland. It does seem like they are growing pretty well. If you look at the investments that are going into some of the stands, eventually Ukraine, and some of the other parts of the former Eastern Bloc, if you like, it does seem like there's a lot of investment in Belarus still. It does seem like there's a lot of investment going in there to help feed parts of the world that longer term probably aren't going to be getting fed by the US.
That makes sense to me with all these different factors. What about China? China's in a pretty interesting spot from a milk production standpoint. They really increased their milk production 3 or 4 years ago and then more or less stabilized it. Where is their cost of production and where does China go from here?
Probably the first point to make is that we've all learned not to bet against China on dairy production in the last 4 or 5 years, on milk production in particular. That's been an incredible rise. And I think the second thing is that lesson to me is then don't bet against them and what they might be able to do with the quality of the product and the investments that they're making in manufacturing capacity now. There's a huge push from China to value add, particularly on the protein side, and to then try and drive that down in sales into Southeast Asia and other parts of the world. They've obviously got a huge domestic market, but when it comes to starting to grow into things like processed cheese or fat exports or even micellar casein exports and MPC exports, that's where I think that their next push is going to be, is trying to move out anything that they don't need domestically. So it's not just going to be bulk whole milk powder, which has been the story of the last 2 or 3 years. The structural issue that they've got is that their population versus their arable land is just huge. That's a long-term limiter, if you like, for how much you can push into exports. Ultimately, as their productivity grows and their incomes grow, they'll be consuming more dairy themselves. The steps that we've seen the last 4 or 5 years were really about shoring up domestic milk capability so that they weren't a victim of world markets. And then now they're trying to value add that milk. They've learned the lesson that you don't grow milk but not grow factories. And they've learned the lesson that you don't grow demand without growing milk. The policy now is let's do step changes as productivity rises to drive income rises. I think that they're going to be putting a push on certain functional products into Asia, but I don't think that they're necessarily in a place to be the driver of global milk production because ultimately their cost of production, going back to where you started, Ted, is higher and it's structurally higher because of the fact that they just don't have enough arable land for the population that they've got.
But with China doing that and really trying to expand into value add and even trying to export, I got to believe that's causing Fonterra and the other New Zealand exporters to really shift their export strategy. What's happening there?
When you look at Fonterra, their stated strategy is to basically be a skim protein and fat company. They have recognized that the days of whole milk powder are limited. China went through a period where they went from 500,000 tonnes of imports pre-COVID to 800,000, and now they're back down to 500,000 again. They've really gone through that boom. And during that period, Fonterra's basically said, we need to move out of whole milk powder and move back into being a skim and fat company. And when I say a skim and fat company, a skim protein and fat company. And so we have seen them push 50 to 70,000 tonnes more skim into Southeast Asia. But what they're now starting to do is to value add that skim, similar to what the US is doing, putting on more ultrafiltration in front of dryers because that's the highest marginal investment that you can do, starting to do more MPCs, starting to do more value add on the fat side as well. There's been some huge investments in UHT cream, which are going to be going ahead or have already gone ahead and are being launched for this year, which draws fat away from butter and AMF. Overall, their stated strategy is to be a nutrition and food service company. Nutrition, protein-heavy products, food service, fat-heavy products. And so they're moving away from that whole milk powder. I think that the next stage for them is to try and drive those two sorts of products into Southeast Asia because China itself is already quite a big market for those sorts of products and is probably screaming out for how do we not use WPC and WPI because that's the highest priced protein in the world right now. So how do we move away from that? I think they're also trying to help Southeast Asia grow protein as a category.
But based on what you said of China's strategy, it almost sounds like it means China and New Zealand are going head to head in that market in Southeast Asia.
Yeah. I think, and look, that's a 5 to 10 year view. We're already seeing traditional Fonterra markets or New Zealand markets. Open country dairy is obviously nearly 20% of the market down there now as well, and are making their own steps towards value adding fat. So that's always one to keep in mind. We're certainly seeing a competition of powder flows and functional product flows from China, including fat, laminated fat, pastry butter, those sorts of things coming into Southeast Asian markets that were traditionally New Zealand dominated markets.
Going back to China's milk production, a lot of rumors about a disease in the northwest of China, hand, foot, and mouth. Very little information. We have several customers that have asked about it. Without going down the rabbit hole, is there any update in that regard?
Super important if it were to be a big story. I think that the likelihood of it being a massive story is low at the moment, from what I've seen at least. The key thing to watch for me in China is always the spot milk price. They've got a fantastic, not that it's particularly visible, but they do have a huge traded liquid milk market between different zones and between companies in specific zones. It's a little bit like your plus minus to the class 3. So that spot milk price to me is always the one which tells you, are they having any problems? And it does seem to me like the containment strategy was quite effective early on. Lock down the zones, stop the movement of the cattle. So yeah, it doesn't look like it, but it's a bit of a black box.
So we don't expect a long-term impact to their production as of right now?
Not at this stage, but that could change tomorrow.
Everybody, we will be right back after these messages.
I'm Diego Carvalho with Ted Jacoby & Company. Ted Jacoby & Company specializes in international dairy markets. For new customers that haven't done business with Jacoby, I would tell them that we can provide them with many of the powders, dairy products that they consume, not only with the physical product, but we can also help them mitigate their risk. We know dairy, we know the main players, we know the main providers for the whole value chain. We are one of the strongest players in the US market because we have contact all the way from the farmer, moving the liquid milk all the way to the end users that buy the end products. I am Diego Carvalho with Ted Jacoby & Company, and we bring dairy to the world. Now back to the show.
Josh, I'm going to put you on the spot. Is the U.S. going to continue to increase our exports? And if so, who do we increase those exports at the expense of? How is that going to play out?
Yes, we're going to absolutely continue to increase our exports. The most obvious area is where there's going to be a need, and that's fat at the moment. It's pretty well noted that we've invested heavily in cheese production. Boy, if those new cheese process facilities are running at the moment, they're happy to have a co-product in whey proteins. Things are looking pretty good at the moment. As a result of that, we're assuming that anybody who can produce cheese or process cheese is trying to process just as much as they possibly can. As a result of that, it seems pretty eminent that the U.S. will continue to have available cheese for the global consumer. Now take a look at the protein side. One of the expected results of this protein movement in the US. And now, again, I want to clarify this movement because I think there's a lot of chatter about GLP-1 being the main driver. And I would almost view that as just a catalyst and a reason why the US market might be leading in protein consumption. Because if you look around the world, this is a health and wellness trend that is not exclusive to the United States, not exclusive to Europe. It's happening everywhere. We receive inquiries from all over the world, including import regions, for protein. Given the limitation on whey protein availability, one would assume that we're going to see quite a migration to milk proteins. And Scott did a great job of alluding to that earlier. We're finding different ways of concentrating protein and delivering it to the consumer. The result of that, fat's going to come along with it. I've listened to Gus, Mike, and the team talk fairly openly about the incredible improvements in components over the past several years from the U.S. dairymen. Scott alluded to component growth in other parts of the world as well. We're going to have surplus fat, and there's going to be extra fat beyond what the U.S. consumer can take in. And as a result of that, we're going to be hungry to capture market share in the global market. Now, you asked, at whose expense? And that's a loaded question in some ways, because I think there's two things going on. I also think fat consumption globally is increasing. Maybe not at the rate protein is, and maybe not as popular right now. But if you look, ever since the early 2000s, when we made this paradigm shift in the US to moving away from the old food pyramid model and moving into this clean label, healthy, consumable products, that no longer was the enemy. And it seems like ever since that happened, the world has also agreed. And we've continued to see more clean label dairy fat being consumed per capita globally. So two things will happen. One is the US, we're in position to grow our milk production more quickly than anywhere else in the world. We have the infrastructure. Currently, we have the economics to do that. And we might outpace that fat consumption growth globally, which means then, yes, we will have to capture some market share. And from who? Yeah, it's either going to be Europe or Oceania. And I think that's a seasonal thing. I don't know that I would point to either single market as being the loser in that, other than that the dairy support and economic situation and the outlook for dairy growth in Europe seems to have more headwinds than the rest of the world. One would assume that they're a bit more vulnerable right now to the US capturing market share.
Joe, what about fat? Josh summed it up pretty clearly. We're going to have to continue to be a net exporter of fat. We're going to continue to add fat into our system with all of these high protein demand and these components that just continue to creep higher and higher. We're not going to consume everything that we can supply. We will have to be a net exporter of fat moving forward until either the supply structurally shifts or we find a different way to utilize it. I agree with Josh and Scott that it's going to be seasonal dependent on whose expense it comes at, because I think our fat market, our butter market specifically, is going the direction that cheese has gone over the past 15 years, where it becomes almost a cyclical market. We'll be really competitive. We'll get a lot of exports on the books. We'll clean up our inventories, and then our pricing will spike. We will not be competitive on exports for a while, which will develop this surplus of domestic inventory and force us to depress pricing again and go back into the export markets.
We have a US bias, obviously, as we're looking at the world. The one limitation to US capturing fat market share is the reputation of US fat being quite a bit different. Our commodity butter is an 80% salted butter. Our packaging is different. The visual appearance of our product is different. The flavor profile of our product is a bit different. Up until now, the opportunity for us to capture market share has happened largely in the processing sector as an ingredient to make something else. As of late, we're starting to realize a little bit more of a win in, say, food service applications and developing markets and other things. From your perspective, how close is the US to penetrating into the food service or retail business in import regions for butterfat?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's two parts to that answer. The first is that you break down trade barriers slowly, but it happens. It's been happening since the start of trade, right? I do think that there's the ability to continue educating the consumer, to get them comfortable with the product, the appearance of the product. I think I said that to Joe once. US butter, it's not terrible. It's a great tagline, but I'm not a marketing guy. It will continue to gain acceptance, I think, Josh. I think the second thing to recognize is that with Fonterra New Zealand trying to put so much fat into food service applications, I think for the point of educating, as you say, what does that mean in Asia and China? It's not necessarily just butter. UHT cream is just this massive category which keeps on growing in Asia. Asia is not this singular thing, like they're all sub-markets, but as a generalization, bakery is huge through a lot of Southeast Asia and China itself. If you travel there, it's cakes, it's pastries, it's a hell of a lot of really nice product. It's seen as a luxury good, if you like, and through the supermarkets and convenience stores and everything like that. That's a huge sector which needs a more functional application. There's a lot of growth in there. That's actually leaving behind ingredient markets for US fat, whether that be in Australia or whether that be into Southeast Asia or the Middle East. So that is actually, to me, probably the lowest hanging fruit. And it's what you've already seen. So it's not like you need to necessarily change the spec immediately to go for these applications. It can be just as easily going for what's been left behind by New Zealand. Just one point that I'd make about whose market share is the US going to take on certain products. The European milk growth in late last year really does mask the fact that we probably still need US butterfat exports to balance the world market. If you were to take the 100,000 excess tons that Europe made in the second half of last year out of the market, say that was unsustainable milk growth for a period of time, once we eat through that stock, we've taken a lot of the US growth, if you like. We've absorbed a lot of that growth in what you've made, and we needed it. So I do think that we're going through a process of still eating through those European stocks overall, and that glut that we had, which was driven by 2 years of fantastically high milk prices. But once we get through that, the global consumer is buying $5,000 butter and they're buying $3,000 skim. And that is a price level that's comfortable in a lot of the world. Middle East is obviously going through a few lumps right now, so we may have some problems on demand in the next 6 months. But once we get through that and hopefully the conflict there is over and they return to some kind of growth, we do get to a position where we probably need US fat in the world market. Mike, you made the comment about how well the US farmer is now not feeding for fat, and it does seem like some of that fat component growth at least is slowing. Do you see responsiveness to fat prices significantly, and how can that change the US fat balance of being a reliable or necessary exporter?
As far as producers' decisions, I've had some conversations, particularly with cheese plants, who are seeing some changes and talking with their producers. Some are making some adjustment to ration, changing sources. And what those sources are finding is what we're seeing in the milk supply. Protein remains relatively strong and still grows. Fat has slowed down a bit, and most of it is PKE. It seems to be the change. Talking with producers, I had a good conversation actually last fall with a very high producing Jersey herd who said that if fat gets below about $1.70, it doesn't really make sense to feed PKE anymore because he isn't getting enough return from it. I think there's probably some doing that. Is it broad? I think when the U.S. cows are milking so well, they're reluctant to make a lot of ration changes that might slow things down. But we're seeing some of it on the margin. Will it solve the problem? No, because it's genetics. It's the genomics, our selection for fat. There's so much variability in fat genetics within cattle, particularly Holsteins, that they've been able to make huge progress. And of course, that's permanent. So I expect that fat will continue to stay high. So will we see some moderate fluctuations from time to time? Sure. That market will, I think, have some effect, particularly since they've gotten so high. Will our trend change? No. We'll continue to improve in fat and in protein with time just because genetic selection in the U.S., particularly with sex semen and genomics, has just gotten so intense that I don't see that changing. The rate of gain will slow because the base population is higher versus the sires that are being used, but that will continue. We may slow down. We're not going to turn around and go the other way.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. I was going to stir the pot a bit and almost take the other side by saying I have a degree in economics, so I succumb to liking to pretend that free trade is how everything works in the world. And it doesn't. And I think we're pretty clearly going down this path of almost a bifurcated world of trade relationships. And I really think it would be a mistake to ignore that moving forward, especially with Russia potentially being able to supply China in the future. We're almost taking for granted that everyone is going to buy from the most efficient producer in the world. And we're really going into this kind of tumultuous geopolitical landscape that it feels like we're probably ignoring. I don't think that changes the fact that the U.S. is still going to have to export. We're producing more than we're going to consume. We're not going to let the product rot. We're probably not going to shut down all these nice facilities we just built. But it does make me question what price we are going to be getting when we go to export the products. What happens to the basis on those export sales? There's a big geopolitical issue when it comes to a lot of the analysis we've just been doing.
How much of the cake is baked? How much growth are we guaranteed to see on US milk supply in the next 2 to 3 years, and cheese supply, just as a function of these investments that have already been made? How much of the world trade has already bifurcated? China's getting it from New Zealand. Okay, that could break. I could see that breaking. I could see the Middle East possibly breaking, like you're already seeing Iran getting certain product from Belarus, or you're already seeing China get part of it. So there could be massive breakages in there, you're right. The challenge is if we were to stop trading between Russia, the stands, and China, if that became one zone and we all became the other zone, like the two biggest linkages are the Middle East and New Zealand, and you probably do flood the market if you were to stop that. Who would get hurt in that scenario? it's probably Europe. It's going to be a race to the bottom to try and kill some of the highest cost milk production. Yeah, how much of the cake is baked?
I would say it is pretty baked, but I think of it more in terms of between the current trends we're seeing and how sticky we suspect they are from a breeding to beef standpoint, specifically cattle supply, beef cattle supply, and being able to continue to supply the beef market with beef. I think we're going to continue to see some really good returns to dairy farmers breeding to beef, which means they are going to resist and be pretty resistant even when the milk price is low, to reducing the number of cows in the U.S. That's number one. That puts in a really hard floor. In addition to that, those dairy farmers, especially the really big ones, are making really good money when you add the beef income on top of the milk income. And they're looking to continue to expand as a result. So in terms of the capacity that's already added, they're going to fill it up. In terms of the additional capacity, which let's just put it this way. Over the last 2 to 3 years, we've had a lot of new capacity. Over the next couple of years, we will continue to have additional capacity added, but at a lower rate than what we just saw. But it's all going to get filled up. I don't think we're going to have a problem over the next 3 to 5 years filling the capacity that we build, because I think that the income situation for the dairy farmer in the U.S. is just in a really good spot. Even if you take, what's our worst case scenario from a milk revenue standpoint? Whey protein prices collapse. We produce so much milk that butter prices stay low, non-fat prices stay low, cheese prices stay low. All that means is we're just going to be that much more competitive in the global market. And I think our overproduction is probably going to hurt Europe more than it's actually going to hurt the U.S.
I'll just maybe add to it that the most obvious way that the U.S. has invested is to add a lot of cheese processing capacity over the past few years, massive investments. People are well aware of it. But the aggregate of all of the incremental expansions and all of that has been really significant as well. It feels almost imminent right now that we were already investing in dairy growth before the beef on farm income reached a level that it's at today. And it just doesn't feel like that's going to change anytime in the near future. And as a result of that, it only maintains or accelerates that desire to make more milk. We were having conversations 24 months ago about how would we have the heifers to grow the herd? How would we do this? We found a way to grow the herd. The component growth outperformed expectations. And it's only been more consistently profitable because the revenue stream's been spread across more things. So we're going to have milk. And if we're going to have milk, we're going to figure out a way to process that milk. And so far, there must have been some really good foresight to do that and build all of this cheese processing capacity to absorb it up till now. And we've got a little runway left to continue to fill them up. But there's conversations at every major place about how do we extend our put through and extend our yield by shipping more condensed skim, by processing more UF milk products, I can go on and on. I don't know if it's exactly what you were asking, but are we done in investing in our ability to process more milk? I don't believe so. The next move had to have already been thought about and has to be under construction. We're years out from the one after that. I think there's plenty that are thinking about the next move.
It's kind of like the beef has created this amazing revenue stream for dairy producers in the U.S., and our use of such semen and beef selection has just improved that. Same with whey proteins and plant profitability. With these very high whey protein isolate and whey protein concentrate prices, even at a 70-cent whey market, your margins on your whey proteins are very high, which gives us plants a little more room to grow. But I think the other part is we've always talked about growth in cheese. The milk proteins are growing too, and as whey protein prices get higher, manufacturers and product developers are figuring out ways to use lower priced dairy protein alternatives, and that market's going to grow as well. How much milk do we have left to dry into whey? How much milk are we going to have left to dry into powder if those markets continue to grow? And we don't think they're done yet. We think that growth is there. Will these prices stay where they are forever? Probably not, but the demand seems to be continuing to grow. Part of it isn't will we grow our plants, it's also what will we be making in those plants? Are we going to be making more focus on other protein products than just cheese?
I think one of the most ironic things about milk production in the U.S. right now is the fact that the biggest danger, the thing that would hurt the dairy farmer the most right now is actually not milk cost. It's beef price. What would happen if the beef price collapses to the point where breeding to beef is no longer profitable? we're going to double the amount of dairy heifers we start producing. Do you know how that plays out? That plays out by, right now, the number of lactations out of a cow has gone from 2 to 3 to 4, which is decreasing the rate of increase of the components in the milk because you're turning over a smaller percentage of your herd every year. All you're going to do is speed that up. So maybe our milk production plateaus or even drops a little bit, but the components in the milk increase will speed up as a result. You've got the U.S. dairy industry now in a position where even the worst case scenario continues to be a threat for Europe or the rest of the world from a milk supply standpoint.
If you look at the percentage of milk in the U.S. that is now produced by these extremely efficient, very well managed, very well leveraged herds. And so our susceptibility is less. It's kind of like we're going through a heat wave right now, Scott, and everybody says, what's that going to do to milk? A whole lot less than it used to, because of the controlled environments of our modern farms. We've done a lot, and kind of like I think in a lot of industries, we've had some good profitability. People have made investments for the long term. When you make big investments for the long term, you don't usually turn around. You're committed to being in the business. I think the biggest thing for us, in my mind, is for years we've been looking at the way and dry milk markets, exports are a huge part of those sales. Cheese is growing. And we've reached a point with cheese where those export sales are becoming more and more important. And so how do we sustain them over time? What do we need to do? I think a good example, Joe's been working a lot with our opportunities in butter over the last 2 years and working with folks that we work with and what do I need to make to take best advantage of those export markets? We'll continue to do that as well. We're just thinking a lot more world demand than just, I need to make a 40-pound block of cheddar and who will buy it. We're trying to think a little harder than that now.
Mike, you touched on, if we'd had the milk production growth that we've had in the last 2 years, 10 years ago, we would have wiped out certain pieces of milk production around the world. The market would not have absorbed that level of additional product. Now, we certainly had a period in October, November, December last year where things got uneconomic in certain part of the world, and we didn't last. Because ultimately the demand shone through. And having listened to the podcast, protein demand and that protein story is a huge part of that in the States. That to me is a trend that's really only beginning around a lot of the other parts of the world. It can go underestimated from your side of the world. You guys are the vanguard in that. You're the leaders in it. You've got the category. China's got a great category in this area and is making some huge investments in it. But we've just seen here in Australia and in Southeast Asia some massive investments from European companies into cottage cheese, into ready-to-drink categories, with the principal idea of exporting them to Asia. And that growth model into developing markets is always put a high-priced product in there that's branded from a developed market and then grow the category with the local champion. You get an imported product, it looks sexy and it looks great and it's like a luxury product. And then you grow the category by producing a lower price point product to try and then get the local population really going for it. And so that's just started. The other thing that's really hot in different parts of Asia is, funnily enough, processed cheese for food service. It's a really quickly growing category. It's a category that gets a lot of interest. We've spent a lot of time on the point of, does the US have a competitive advantage for supply in this kind of changing world? I think one of the biggest pieces of competitive advantage that the States has is its ability to grow an export pathway. It's a mindset, it's a trade infrastructure as well, with government relations and everything like that allows you to grow into world markets in a way that probably a lot of other places don't have. If we've got a growing demand, and I made this point before, you might see a few lumps here, mainly because of the Middle East, right? The Middle East looks a little bit overbought, looks a little bit quiet. Southeast Asia's having a few little hiccups with changes in Indonesia and some of their currency devaluation, like these sort of short-term issues. But longer term, it's very comfortable for a Southeast Asian consumer buying $2,800 to $3,200 skim and $5,000 butter. These are price points that work now, which never worked before. That's the growth price point now. I do think that we're going to have a situation where the world market is going to be the next engine for some of the growth in protein demand and fat demand as well.
Scott, being based in Australia, I'd be interested to hear your perspective on the potential Super El Niño that was confirmed this week. How does that factor into your outlook for dairy production in Oceania over the next year or two? And how concerned should producers in Australia and New Zealand be if it develops as forecasted?
So it's a very detailed topic. The El Niño indicator that everybody looks at is the Southern Oscillation Index, which is screaming El Niño at the moment. The reality is that what impacts Australia and New Zealand is not just the El Nino. It can be a major impact, but we've also had years where it has had no impact, and probably even at a similar level of El Nino indicator. And the reason for that is the El Nino obviously talks about what's happening out in between South America and Asia, so that pressure. But our weather system, particularly in our dairy regions, is just as impacted by how much moisture is exiting Antarctica and moving north. In the southern parts of Australia, which are our heavy dairy regions, and also into New Zealand. The other weather system that impacts our dairy production during spring and our moisture levels is how much tropical cyclone activity is actually exiting the Pacific Islands and moving down into the North Island of New Zealand, which really doesn't have a lot to do with El Nino either. The key point is that right now, El Nino, it's a real phenomenon, but it's not the only thing that's going to impact Oceania. And when you look back at the history, which we have, some years it's a really important thing, and other years you can have a fantastic spring in what seems to be an El Nino year. The other point that I'd make is that we have fantastic moisture right now. We're getting huge rainfalls through Australia particularly, but also in New Zealand, which are really recharging things over winter. Economics would also mean that we've all got a fair bit of silage buffered away from the last 12 months of good weather. So I don't think at this stage we're seeing anything that's like a huge impact on oceanic dairy, but it's very early. The thing that we're all going to need to watch out for is how much does it rain, particularly in New Zealand in December. New Zealand in December, January, that's really when we have to start looking at what might happen.
Cool. All right. Scott, this was a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your insight and your expertise in what's going on the other side of the pond. Thank you.
Likewise, thank you very much. Cheers, guys.
Next time on the Milk Check.
The U.S. exports, as we go forward here over the next few years, is at a crossroad. Do we swing back to balancing to milk fat, which would mean we're probably short of protein? Or do we start balancing to protein, which means we're going to need to find holes for a heck of a lot more cheese and butter?
Join us and our special guest, Will Lux from the U.S. Dairy Export Council, as we discuss the future of U.S. dairy exports.
We welcome your participation in the Milk Check. If you have comments to share or questions you want answered, send an email to podcast@jacoby.com. Our theme music is composed and performed by Phil Kagi. The Milk Check is a production of T.C. Jacoby and Company.
The best part of my job is working directly with cheesemakers and helping their businesses run better, because they make wonderful, great products. Anything we can do to make them more successful not only helps them, but helps Jacoby. We look at how milk flows through their plant, what their real costs of products are. So when they're making marketing decisions, making new investments, particularly on whey processing, they have a benchmark to use to determine what opportunities they have and what the returns would be. Whey has become so valuable with these high protein markets. There's added value that they can get by just condensing it and maybe moving further down the supply chain in the longer term, making products themselves. My role is to help them cost that so they have a better understanding of what the opportunities can be. Longer term, we expect the whey protein market to remain very valuable. For one part of the supply chain to be successful, everyone has to be. My superpower is practical application of data and analysis. I believe firmly that Jacoby's success is because we help our suppliers and our buyers be successful. I'm Mike Brown, and I love working for TC Jacoby because I get to help people make their businesses more successful.